Hello, we have a guest today, very well known Grandmaster Larry Christiansen. And our topic today is a Samisch variation of King's Indian. We have several DVDs made how to play King's Indian for black, but this time we have to cover something, we're going to cover something for white. And this is going to be Samisch variation that Larry is very good at and one of the best known specialists in this part of the opening, in this variation. So here is Larry, and enjoy, sit back, enjoy, and learn.
Hi everybody, this is Larry Christensen, and we'll be talking about the Samish King's Indian. First, I thought I might talk a little bit about why I got interested in playing the Samish King's Indian. The King's Indian defense, which is characterized by the fianchetto of his King Bishop, this is your basic position, often leads to very nice black counterattacks, pawn storms against the castled white king on the king's side. And as a youngster, I never liked being on the receiving end of a kingside attack. I like to be on the delivering end. So I looked around, this is around 1980s, I looked around for an opening, a line against the King's Indian, where white controlled events, where white did the attacking, where white pushed black around. And so I hit upon the famous Samish King's Indian, which is characterized by the move F3. Purpose of that F3 move, pawn move, is to anchor, secure that, fortify that pawn on E4, set up a beautiful safe haven for the dark squared bishop on E3, and to also promote a possible spike attack later on. On the downside, the pawn move F3 does tend to weaken dark squares, notably E3, F4, that area D4, and it does little to it's not a developing move. It's a pawn move, not a piece move. But I still think the pluses outweigh the minuses. Okay, let's now, before moving to our main area, I should talk a little bit about some rare sidelines. Let's say black, for instance, now played E5, inviting white to trade pawns and trade queens, depriving black of the right to castle. That's an anemic, wimpy line. We don't need to play that way. I'd rather keep the tension in the center, knight GE2, and follow up with bishop E3 and queen D2. Keep the tension and with a view towards castling queenside. Most of the time, black will play here castles. And I mean, when I say most of the time, it's probably 95% of the time. And I like now bishop E3. That's the good save, good solid attacking move. And also now white's ready to play queen D2, creating a battery of queen and bishop on that diagonal. Now after bishop E3, black has quite a number of choices. The most popular here, no question about it, are E5, knight C6, that's the Pano variation, the gambit line C5, which will not be the focus of our discussion in this video, and you have some side lines like knight BD7 and C6. If black plays E5, white has several options, but I think the attacking player's option would now be knight GE2, keeping the tension in the center and keeping our focus on queen D2 followed by long castling. Now after knight GE2, let's say black plays knight BD7. White plays queen D2. Now black plays C6, and white castles long. Now he's got a very nice attacking formation, ready if black plays particularly sluggishly to follow with moves like h4 and g4. If black plays correctly, white can pursue a more positional approach, maybe moves like king b1. And if b5, for instance, white can play pawn takes c5, e5, pawn takes e5, and now that knight on e2 has a new square, c1, where it can maneuver to. And here white would pursue a positional strategy, applying pressure on the d file, and also black's weak squares like c5, d6. This knight on c1, for instance, very well can maneuver to b3 very effectively. So let's return to our position after bishop e3. So again, I advocate against e5, keep the tension in the center and pursue the plan of queen d2 and long castles. Just for the record, if you close the center, black has some very tricky lines like knight h5. This is the kind of line that we don't need to deal with, intending queen h4 check. So let's return and go back to what I consider the most critical line of the King's Indian, and that is knight c6. So now we'll talk about the knight c6 line, also known as the Pano variation. The Pano variation is basically designed to entice white into advancing his pawns in the center, for instance with d5. When that happens, that's usually bad. Black plays knight e5, and sooner or later, usually sooner, white's pawn, center, will come under attack by means of c6, possibly e6. It'll get chopped away, and assuring black excellent counterplay, good squares for his pieces. Generally just not a good idea, and a total distraction from our real goal, which should be to launch a kingside attack. Okay, so after knight c6, a much better way two better ways to play either queen d2 or knight ge2. They're very similar, and they often transpose. For our purposes, we'll play knight ge2. I just like to get my knights developed and go from there. Now if black now plays e5, which a lot of people might think, oh, gee, that must be the right move, then white does fix the center. He plays d5. He chases that knight to a bad square, e7. That's a terrible square for the knight, where it is dominated by white's pawn structure. The f5 square and the c6 squares are now occupied, and the knight's crowded in by his own pieces, g8, c8, and g6. And here, white will be in position very shortly to play queen d2, g4, and h4, followed by h5 and the standard and typically crushing kingside attack. So knight e7, a terrible lemon. e5 is a terrible lemon. Black should play a6. That's the correct move, and the purpose behind a6 is to play for a quick b7, b5 to launch counterplay aimed at the future hiding spot of the white king, queenside. Well, after a6, white should just continue queen d2, setting up the queen bishop battery. He may or may not trade dark squared bishops depending on circumstances. Also, that prepares long castling. And now black should continue again, rook b8 to promote b7, b5. Very passive move is bishop d7. And you still see that once in a while, even by very strong grandmasters. And bishop d7, now the idea behind that move, it's just a generic developing move. But it really does not, and it just really doesn't do that much for black's position. I think here's a good example of how white should handle the attack. He goes h4. Now, most of the time, black cannot afford to let white play h5, so he responds by h5. So if white tries to open lines, he's going to pay a price for it. The price of admission, for instance, on the king side will be g4, hg4, and white lacks sufficient counterplay for his pawn investments. But a better move here for white would be bishop h6, trading off dark squared bishops. And black now reacts in the center with e5. And the purpose of that move now, if white plays d5, maybe black can jump into d4 actively, or perhaps even capture on h6. Queen takes h6, and then play knight d4. And he's a bit distracted by black's activity in the center. His attack can run aground. So here, better move is castles, holding everything in place and getting the rook on d1 suddenly into action. And let's say black plays b5. Well, this will be similar to the main line I'll be discussing later. Then white should just play knight d5 to eliminate black's stalwart defensive piece, that knight on f6. And this gives black severe headaches, defensive headaches. He can either accept a positionally inferior game with moves like knight takes d5 and c takes d5 and knight takes d4 and knight takes d4, e takes d4, bishop takes g7, king takes g7. Now here white doesn't need to attack. He can just play positionally. And queen takes d4 check. He's got a very, very nice pawn structure. Black has a very weak pawn on c7. White's no doubt going to quickly move his king to b1 and bring a rook to c1. If black trades queens, his endgame is inferior because of that weak c-pawn. It's all risk, all gain and very little risk for white in this position. So you do see bishop d7 once in a while, but it's considered too passive to really bother white. So, back to our main line, rook b8 is clearly superior to bishop d7. b7, b5 is now on the agenda for black, and that has a influence on white's center, plus it creates play for black on the queen side. There's no question about it. And this line is the subject now of much debate. And I've wrestled with this line for many, many years. Once upon a time, I liked the move knight c1. I won quite a number of games with it. But eventually, I just became dissatisfied with this move based on the answer de5, d5, and knight d4. And to make a long story short, after knight b3, c5, it's all best play, d takes c6, b takes c6, exclamation point, knight takes knight. You can't let a knight like that hang around for long. E takes d4, bishop takes d4. Now white's a pawn up, but his king is stuck in the center. Rook e8, bishop e2, d5. Black has a very nice game. Even though he's down a pawn, he's got compensation in the form of very active, dangerous play. White must be very careful here. For attackers, this is the kind of we're on the receiving end of counterplay. We're not the givers of the attack. We're not leaders at leading the attack. So let's go back and discuss some other continuations till I finally think I hit on the right way to play this. Back to our position after rook b8. Now I should also talk about I also have tried bishop h6, which is an attractive move, and trading off dark squared bishops. It's a first move you'd think about. The problem with bishop h6, though, is that black can now just respond with b5, getting his pieces. It's safer than taking. Some people might be tempted to play bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and e5. I've actually faced that move. Not a good idea for a defender. Okay, so now let's give an example here. What happens if black plays something passive like bishop d7? I have right in front of me a pretty good example. Game played this between Grandmaster Bu Zhangji and Grandmaster Vadim Svyagintsev, played in the Russian Team Championship 2008. And I think also this is a very good illustration of how white should attack in this line of the Samisch King's Indian. So white plays bishop h6. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Not never bad, but sometimes not the most effective. Here I think it is the most effective, especially combined with the main theme, which is a later knight d5. So black answered bishop h6 standard way, reacts in the center with e5. White castles. And now black starts his counterplay with b5. So he's stirring up trouble as quickly as possible on white's king. And now Bu plays knight d5 to eliminate that powerful, that key defensive piece, the knight on f6. The knight on f6 is not just near the black king, it's also helping to guard the g2, g4 square. So it must be eliminated. And here's Svyagintsev played rook e8. White immediately gets down to work with g4. Now, because of the threat of exchanging those knights, this move is now feasible. H takes g4. And white pursues his attack with h5. And so here, what happens if black plays, let's say knight takes h5. Here's what happens, very thematic too. White then plays bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now knight g3, threatening to trade off that knight on h5. If knight takes g3, queen h6 check delivers mate. King g8, queen h8 mate. So back here, after knight g3, let's say black plays rook h8 to fortify his king position. Well, then white plays knight takes h5 check. Let's say black now plays g takes h5. White will then play f takes g4, opening more lines. Black tries to keep it as closed as possible. Bishop takes g4. And here, white has the luxury of playing bishop e2. And black's king is getting increasingly exposed. Black's defenses are being whittled down, and that's very powerful knight on d5 as the star of our show. Black is very hard pressed to withstand the attack. The rook on d1 is soon to go to g1. Black can have that pawn on d4. Let's say knight takes d4. White can follow that up with bishop takes g4, h takes g4, and now rook g1 is very unpleasant for black. White has a very strong attacking play here. Let's go back. And watch how the actual game progressed. After g4. Black took on g4, h5, and I might also add, I think knight takes h5, white can even play knight g3 directly. The point being, knight takes g3, bishop takes g7. Now king takes g7 leads to checkmate, and if knight takes h1, here comes the queen, barreling down to h6, threatening checkmate, and well, black has no defense. f6, among many wins, bishop takes f6 looks simple enough, very convincing, threatening mate numerous ways, and the queen, black quickly collapses. So after g4, the characteristic g4, black took on g4, h5, and black now played g takes f3. He's trying to make white pay an extremely high price for opening all these lines. White captured on g6. Doesn't hesitate to sacrifice material for the pursuit of his attack. Black countered that with f takes g6. This is if f takes g2, white can now play bishop takes g7, surrendering the rook. E takes d1 equals queen check. King takes d1, and now white's threatening mate in 2. And if he plays king takes g7, that leads to checkmate with queen h6 mate. Black really has no defense, despite his rook advantage in material. Note how ruthless white is in opening lines. I mean, that is the name of the game here. No wasted motion. Sack, deliver mate. Rip open, tear open the black defenses. So after h takes g6, black played f takes g6. And now white conserves his knight on e2 for attacking purposes. It supports its brother on d5, knight e2 to c3. So white has, let's take stock here, white has 5 pawns, black has 7, but he's already punched a gaping hole in black's king position. The pawn on f3 really doesn't mean much. And then knight on d5 is just dominating the position. And of course, black king is about to face the music after bishop takes g7. So here black played knight takes d4, and he was quickly swamped after bishop takes g7, king takes g7, knight takes f6, queen takes f6. So he's finally traded off the key black defensive piece. And now knight d5, attacking that queen, sending it back to f8. And white now came in with queen h6 check. Black tries to run. White stops him from running with queen g5 and threatens now rook h7 check, murderous threat. And black answered that with queen g7. And now this theme of this game is eliminating key defenders. White eliminates now the black's pride and joy on d4. Rook takes d4. E takes d4. That's black's last line of defense has been breached. And now queen f4 check. And suddenly black notices if he plays king e6, that's lead checkmate in one move. And king g8, knight f6 check is also not appealing. So in desperation, Mr. Zvyaginzev played bishop f5, and now white's attack reached critical mass. E takes f5, g5, trying to keep lines closed. White plays queen g4. Now he's accessing the h5 square. That's the threat. And black took into account black's last gasp here. Rook e1 check, king d2, rook a e8. And now after queen h5 check, black recognized that there was no good defense to the upcoming f6. Now let's take a quick look, see if, for instance, king g8, white plays f6, and the queen's got nowhere to go. If it goes to f7, white delivers checkmate. If it goes to f8, he delivers mate. And if he goes to d7, well, that's not much of a help either. f7 check, queen takes f7, and mate anyway. We get the idea. Also in this position, if king f8, f6, the same story. Essentially, if queen f7, queen h6 check, followed by mate next move. And if queen g8, white surrenders that pawn again with f7. And again, if queen takes f7, now we deliver mate, queen h8 check, queen g8, queen f6 check, queen f7, and rook h8 checkmate. A good thematic game, well worth reviewing. It's a must-know game. Good example of how to blast open lines, sacrifice material within reason, and go after the black king. And it's games like that that illustrate why passive moves like bishop d7 have lost favor. So bishop d7 is considered slightly second rate. Black's best move is rook b8. Immediately seeking quick counterplay with b7, b5. And if white would be foolish enough to play a4, that'd be not a good move here. That would, for white, create problems later on. Black can, for instance, he could play perhaps knight a5 straight away, threatening pawn on c4, threatening to play knight b3, winning the exchange, and also paving the way for moves like c7, c5. Perhaps it actually should be preceded by e7, e5 at once, and if d5 to play knight a5. Knight c1 covering, and then black can play c5. And obviously white cannot risk castling queenside here. Castling kingside would be the only way to go, but black's going to achieve very, very solid counterplay. Bishop moves like bishop d7 and maybe b5 later. So a4 is that's maybe worth testing, but I don't think it's the best move. Also worth considering is bishop h6. We saw that move played in the Boo Zvyagintsev game, and that's a move I have tried myself in practice. I had a game of Once Upon a Time back in Germany, 1994, against international master Stefan Reschke, where my opponent played bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, e5, reacting in the center. But also he's brought the white queen within proximity of black's king. I mean, probably not a good idea. And after e5, I played rook d1. Also a good move, perfectly good move would be to castle, but rook d1 kept my option of, believe it or not, castling short alive. And I figured the white king actually was safer on e1 or on the king side than it would be on the queen side, where it might meet counterplay based on b7, b5. I think this is a fairly instructive example, so let me go through this. Rook d1, my opponent played e takes d4, abandoning the center. I think he would be better served playing b7, b5, going for straight counterplay. Chances for both sides. It's a dynamic, exciting position. I happen to favor white here after b5, but I think I would take white. My opponent played e takes d4. Not a terrible move, but it can lead to trouble if he's not careful. And now he played knight e5. I think here black should have played knight takes d4, rook takes d4, and get his queen off of that file and play queen e7, with a view towards playing queen e5, and who knows, maybe getting queen g3 check in. The question is, do I have anything better than a move like queen g5? And here I can see black has an option trading queens, queen with queen e5. Probably white's a little better, but nothing that's significant. So after e5, rook d1, e takes d4, knight takes d4. Black played knight e5. And so I haven't completed on my development. I'd like to get my rooks connected. g4 is out of the question. That's too impetuous here. It's reckless and just plain bad. And I'm not well enough developed to play yet moves like c5. I'd like to, but I'd like a little more development first. So I played bishop e2. And now black played a bit passively. Perhaps c5 here was a better prescription for success. c7, knight c2, queen b6, for instance, to keep me preoccupied on the queen side. My pawn on b2 is vulnerable. Another idea might be to just get the queen off of that diagonal, off that file, and play queen e7. However, black played c6, and now I played queen g5, and here that's quite a good square for the queen. It ties the black queen down to the knight on f6. In some cases, my dreams of g4 can be realized. All-purpose good move. Black played bishop d7, again a bit passive. Maybe queen e7 was a better try. Bishop d7.
I agree with Larry. This is Roman back again. Black does have a passive position because they played maybe passively before, but even if black played on last move instead of bishop d7, queen e7, I don't think it's really changes much here. So white castle here. Actually, I present at this game. I was present and I saw a very well conducted game by Larry. Black finally made attempt uh, to get some activity, so white played c5. Obviously, a move was prepared by by white. B5, c5 was prepared. D takes c, and white could have taken queen takes e5, and after cd, rook takes d4, maybe even queen takes d4 with some advantage. But the move played by white was a lot stronger. Was knight e6. Before taking the knight on e5, white completely damages black's pawn structure. Queen takes e5, and after c4, rook d6, white completely dominates whole board, and white won very shortly. We don't have to go through all this the rest of the game. Now, here what I would like to go over some Samisch positions that Larry didn't cover, and those are positions with a closed center, with the e5 for black and d5 for white. So center is closed, so the development in the opening slightly different. Now d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d6, e4, bishop g7, f3 castle, bishop e3, e5. Now, besides knight e2 move, there is knight e2 move, but there is a move d5 that was very popular years ago, and lately black was getting some counterplays with knight h5, so that's why d5 is not played maybe that often. But I don't know if it's right assessment of the situation. I think white can still play this variation, hoping for getting advantage and very good position. Now, there is a move queen d2. An idea of knight h5 besides the regular f5 would have been queen h4 check. Okay, let's go back to the original position after knight h5, and I have to mention queen d2 is one choice, and that's the only move was ever played until some time, until recently, like several years ago. And this move was because there is not conceivably the other logical move for white. But that's not true. Let's go first with queen d2 move that is so well known, and queen h4 check. Here I would recommend for white in this position to go bishop f2, but I don't think white gets that much of advantage anyway. After queen e7, bishop is slightly misplaced on f2, and then black goes f5. So the reason why we don't want to go g3 is this, because knight takes g3, and now black sacrifices queen for enough material, and position becomes very unclear. I would recommend to stay away from these continuations. White must play queen f2, because on bishop f2 knight takes f1. So queen f2, this is old variation and reasonably good for black. Knight takes a1, queen takes h4, knight takes e3, creating threats of knight c2 check and knight g2 check. And after king f2, knight takes c4. Now black has two bishops and two pawns for a queen, and minor pieces may be good here, especially when they have potentials for f5. I would like to stay away from this position if I was white, and that's what I would recommend. Now, what I would recommend instead, if you already have this position, as I mentioned already, it's bishop f2, because queen f2, after exchanging queens, black has very easy game, and I don't think white has any advantage at all here. So what I would recommend the other move after knight h5, and that I saw the game played on it, was a very impressive win for white, and I really like it very much. Move that positionally unsound, g4. Now obviously queen h4 check now loses to bishop f2, queen hangs and knight hangs, so black's only sensible answer is knight f4, and now white simply went queen d2. So what white wants to do, we definitely don't want to win this pawn and give black completely dominating bishop on g7. That's not our intention. Our intention for white to castle long and to remove f4 knight surgically with knight e2. So black went f5, g takes f, g takes f, and white castled. I would say this position is bad for black, because I would know what to do here for black. So black played a6, potentially maybe trying b5. They could have done knight d7 right away. I don't think this would have changed, because the way game developed is very typical for this position. Black could have tried slightly different, but I don't think it affects evaluation of this position. a6, h4. That's a good move. Possibly knight h3. Now knight d7 was played, and white took the pawn on f5. You see, black cannot recapture now with the bishop. So black played rook takes f5, and now simply knight e2. And black, I think, practically lost in this position, because if black takes the knight, white will take back. Now bishop d3 is coming, rook g1 is coming, and knight e4 is coming. This is absolute domination and very powerful attack. But what happened in the game, black went knight f8, white played knight takes f4, pawn takes f4, and now my choice would have been white played bishop takes f4 and eventually won the game, actually real quick. I also like very much bishop d4 move, eliminating defender, and later going bishop d3 with overwhelming attack for white. Black is unconditionally lost. Now let's look at some other positions of closed center, and those are the positions when after d4 knight f6, c4 g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f3, castle, bishop e3. Now, center can be closed with e5, d5, or c5, d5. That's not the problem for white. It's okay to play with a closed center, and we will talk a little bit about this type of pawn structure. However, there is a variation c5. That's a pawn sacrifice that was invented. Actually, it was invented by me maybe like over 30 years ago. And then it was refuted by white and was forgotten for many, many years. And then it was reinstated, and black found some sufficient counterplay, and it was popular again. What I would recommend here for you to do is how to play this position. The easy way to get an advantage that was proven very convincingly by a chess program that I adore by Ripka. That's an easy way to play for white. D takes C, D takes C. Let's go quickly with this. Queen takes D8, rook takes D8. This is all theoretical position. Bishop takes C5, knight C6, and now knight E2. Now the way black gets counterplay here is knight D7, and after bishop E3, knight to B4, threatening knight C2 check, or knight E5, threatening knight D3 check. Eventually, it becomes the same position. Knight E5, knight F4, and after knight B4, threatening knight C2 check, white gets very good position by playing rook c1. This is known theoretical position, and well, several games were played and all ended in a quick draw, in a position where white was much better. So what was played, g5. Now knight f goes to d5, knight d3 check, bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, king e2, knight takes c1, rook takes c1. This position is known. This is all theory. And here white has a pawn for exchange, but they're gonna win very next move. Second pawn, e7 is hanging, g5 is hanging, and also there is a threat of going knight c7, and after rook b8, bishop takes a7. Well, our goal to give overview on a Samisch variation. I don't want to go too far with it. However, to deep analysis, but I have already done that, and it's going to take a lot of time. If you have any chess engine, you try to display this position and let this engine analyze it. You will see clearly white has overwhelming position. They're going to have two pawns for exchange and totally dominating position. This is not a good variation for black. Okay, this is the way you gonna play if black chooses to play pawn sacrifice variation with c5. But again, chances are you are not gonna see it too often. So instead of c5 move, what else is there? In this position, black wants to play c5, but they want to prepare to go b6. And then c5, eventually we're gonna get close positions. And we have to see how to play those positions. Let's see. On b6, we play bishop d3. Black must go a6 before they go c5. Right now, c5 loses because of e5. And eventually, whether black moves right away with the knight or after taking they move back, bishop e4 is gonna trap black's rook on a8. So that's why the a6 move was important. Knight e2, c5, d5. So I would recommend, this is very good position. Now after knight d7, let me explain what is the main goal for white. Main goal for white is to keep all, you see each side has 4 minor pieces, to keep them all alive and not to exchange minor pieces just like this. For example, this position would have been a lot better for black than this. The reason is, I already explained this on the previous number of previous DVDs, that when one side has space disadvantage, same goes for accelerated Draken that we play for black in Marozzi bind variation of or some others. It's not good to have too many minor pieces, because with space disadvantage you have problem placing them correctly. So what happens in this position? White must stop knight e5, which will take the bishop, because c4 pawn in attack after bishop c2. White played knight g3. Black went knight e5, and after bishop e2, black went e6. Well, here we get actually nearly forced continuations. What black wants to do, they want to take on d5, and they may have some counterplay. Or if we take cd, they may go b5. But I saw the game, white played interesting f4. Of course, black was ready for it and had tactical maneuver in mind. Knight to g4, temporarily sacrificing a piece. Bishop g4, knight takes g4, everything is forced. Queen takes g4. Now e takes d, attacking the queen and having d4 in mind. It turned out this position is bad for black. And the reason why position is bad for black is f5. Black is forced to get the piece back with d4. Now bishop g5. The only way black can win one of white's minor pieces back is f6. Then white goes bishop d2, and after d takes c, bishop takes c3. This is actually a classical position of two bishops disadvantage. Bishop on g7, I don't want to discuss the quality of this bishop because it's obvious. Bishop on c8 does not really have active diagonal. So taking gf will be very bad after knight takes f5, and not taking is also not good. White is gonna castle, and I would say without exaggeration that black is completely lost. So that's another position that is not good for black. Now there are few positions left. We need to talk about these positions, and those are the positions with closed pawn center. For example, d4 knight f6, c4 g6 knight c3 bishop g7 e4 d6 f3 castle, and the bishop e3. Well, in this position, white may go e5 d5, and we already covered knight h5 move, but c6, and later c takes d. How do we play this position? Although we know that Samisch is played by white to play queen d2, g4, h4 and go for checkmate, this is not the case. We have to play this position differently. We have to play bishop d3, knight e2, and castle the king side. In the case of c takes d, we don't want to analyze this position concretely, because what I want to do is outline for you plan. General plan: white wants, when the center is closed and you see this type of pawn structure with c pawns or without, you can see clearly white's big space advantage on the queen side. So in this position that we just got, we go knight e2, castle, and you see two bishops aiming on a queen side. We go queen b3, rook c1, maybe double rooks on c file. So your target is the queen side. White will try to play f5 and f4. But this is not good plan for black with open c file, because knight h5, f5, f4, an idea to checkmate white on the king side has nothing to do with the open c file. If you wanna try this playing from both sides, you will see that white's threats are more significant and white is several tempos ahead in development of their plan. So this is also not very good position for black. This is not good to play for black. So what does it leave? Now, to give complete overview on Samisch, Larry covered some modern positions of c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f3, castle, bishop e3, of knight c6. So e5 and c5 are thoughts. c5 immediately, we're gonna take the pawn on c5, and go for the variation I already mentioned with the sacrifice. So this is good, and it's completely covered by us. b6 with potential c5 is also good for us, because b6 we go bishop d3, a6, queen d2, c5, d5. So that leaves us some continuations like knight d7. It's a typical King's Indian move in very old fashion. Now we go queen d2 and c5. Now I've seen these positions played many times by white, and I would recommend to stick with d5 move. However, knight e2 is also was very popular. You can play knight e2 and castling long side and going for h4, but d5 is okay too. And here black has problems going e6, because after taking d6 pawn is hanging. Well, if you go d5, you have to make sure that you play h4 and g4, because castling queen side may be a little dangerous, because black will get quickly counterplay. Maybe you should start h4 g4 without castling. You either do this or you play knight e2 right away. However, after queen d2, knight d7 and queen d2, black may go e5, and then after d5 to play some kind of a variety, not knight h5, variety of f5 continuation. Well, this is actually interesting position. We castling long, and black plays f5. This is ages old position, and there is more than one way to play for white. One way to play in general, I'm going to tell you in words, is to keep center closed. The other way is to take. It may be done on this move to take, or maybe after bishop d3 to take, but two types of positions. So I recommend e takes f, g takes f, and bishop d3. Our plan is to go knight e2 and eventually g4. So if black plays, for example, knight f6, now they have a problem with this knight. We go knight e2, and eventually we want to go g4, maybe rook g1 and g4. But you see, even if it's gonna cost you a pawn, sometimes it's very good to do it, because you go rook g1 and you're going to have an attack on the king side. But you don't have to sacrifice a pawn, of course. You can go rook h to g1 and then h3 preparing g4. And it's interesting to point here that after g4 it's almost never good for black to play f4, because we simply retreat and we have dominating square on e4, and these pawns gonna still moving, creating more threats on the king side. Well, actually, this concludes full overview of Samisch. Of course, to cover Samisch with every continuation and every variation, it takes a long time, and it's a lot more to it. But we are not covering complete Samisch. We covered only Samisch, how to play it for white. And in each case, I gave you one minimum one, together with Larry, we gave you minimum one suggestions of how to play certain positions. There are other ways, but we covered a lot of different continuations for black. How should we respond to them? And in every case, if you play Samisch correctly, I guarantee you, you're gonna get reasonably very, very um, good positions and very good game with a plan that was clearly outlined for you in every continuation. So play Zamish and good luck with it.